Thank you very much, Patrick, for that kind introduction. And thank you very much to the European Financial Forum for inviting me here today. It's a very impressive event, and it's good to be participating in such a good timing also of the event, considering where we are in the Brexit discussions and Brexit process. And indeed, my contribution will be focusing on Brexit. I will be looking at it from the perspective of a European securities markets regulator. And obviously, Brexit is very important for the EU capital markets. I think it was formulated this morning by Philip Lane as the unwinding of the single market, and that is indeed a good description of what we're confronted with in the capital markets. And so, as a result of Brexit, sadly but inevitably, there will be the largest capital market of the EU, will be leaving the single market, and that indeed is a market which is currently very much interconnected, partly as a result of the success of the internal market, and we need to prepare for that process. Within ESMA, we spent quite some time and resource on Brexit, and I should say indeed is that a significant amount of that time and resource is spent on the scenario where there would be a Brexit without a deal. What I would like to do in my contribution is first talk indeed about these preparations on the side of ESMA regarding securities markets for Brexit, and most of it is indeed focusing at this stage on the risk of a no-deal scenario by the end of March. And I will be focusing on trading, clearing and cooperation arrangements. And secondly, I also want to look beyond Brexit and think about the world after Brexit, and how should we look at regulation and supervision, and what kind of improvements might be necessary to ensure that regulation and supervision continue to be effective. But let me first focus indeed on the ESMA Brexit preparations for a no-deal situation. And I will focus first on trading, and many of you will be knowing that as a result of MiFID, there's quite a range of thresholds that are now established for the capital markets at EU level, based on data which are exchanged with the member states and with ESMA, and to set a number of thresholds. And for example, the double volume cap, which is about trying to limit the amount of dark pool trading, is established on the basis of data that are very regularly exchanged with ESMA. The question, of course, is what will be happening to these type of thresholds in the area of trading, in the area of capital markets? How will they be affected in the case of a no-deal situation? First of all, the very granular and detailed data exchange that we have been establishing with the UK in the past year, since the start of MiFID in January last year, that will have to stop. There's no legal basis anymore to collect those data. And the second question is, of course, how will the UK data that we have collected, how will they be used in future calculations? Seems to be quite a mundane issue, but it's very important for capital market functioning, for trading in the EU. And we have issued a public statement last week where quite in some detail we explain how we will treat the data in future calculations. But there's, of course, the broader issue: what should we do and how should we look at the MiFID II thresholds more generally, with a new situation where there will be a very large and liquid market outside of the EU, but still very important to the EU. We have decided at this stage is that we will not change the thresholds as such. We will maintain them as such, but clearly we need to reconsider that once there is a better view of the future relationship with the UK in financial services. And just to emphasize how it will change the capital market functioning, I think it's interesting to go back to the start of MiFID II, when we had and where you could see the impact of having a very large and liquid market outside of the EU, but still very important for the EU. When we started in January last year, we had some problems with the so-called tick size regime, which is determined on the basis of the liquidity in the EU. But obviously for some instruments that were in that case traded in Switzerland, which is a liquid market, you could see migration of trading going to the Swiss markets because there was not the proper calibration of the tick size for those cases where you had a liquid market outside of the EU. And so, in addition to the tick size regime, there are some other MiFID II provisions where third country trading venues play an important role. One of those provisions, which has raised concerns among market participants in case of a no-deal Brexit, is the trading obligation for shares. EU investment firms are only allowed to trade shares subject to this trading obligation in the EU and on third country trading venues that have been declared as equivalent by the European Commission. To date, no such equivalence decision exists for the UK. ESMA is looking at this issue with a view to avoiding disruption in financial markets as far as possible, while respecting the intention of the trading obligation as foreseen in MiFID II. And we intend to provide more clarity on this matter sufficiently ahead of the Brexit date. Let me then move on to the second area, which is clearing. As you probably are aware, clearing has been identified as one of those areas where a public intervention is justified from the perspective of stability risks for the EU financial markets. That has been the reason for the equivalence decision in December by the European Commission. And on that basis, we have started the recognition process of the CCPs, and that is also already mentioned earlier here this morning. Currently, we are on track with the recognition process. We have announced that we will try to get to recognition decisions sufficiently ahead of time before the end of March. And as I just said, we are on track with the various steps of that recognition process. In addition, we have said regarding non-centrally cleared derivatives, so the ones that are not centrally cleared, is that in that case there is no stability risk that would warrant a public intervention, but what we have done is that we have supported the repapering process from the UK to the EU 27 with some facilitation and a change in the rulemaking. And it's such a change that it would avoid that the repapering from the UK to the EU 27, that would result in new requirements, for example, regarding the clearing obligation. That standard has been endorsed by the Commission after submission by us, and currently it is in the political process, or it's in the Parliament and Council, and we're optimistic that that will be concluded very soon. Finally, on settlement, what I should mention, and what was already mentioned earlier this morning, that there is indeed also this very specific situation of the Irish securities markets being very dependent on a UK CSD, and so that has also been identified as an area where public intervention is justified, and we have also started the recognition process of that specific UK CSD, and we expect to be on time with the recognition decision in that case. Let me then finally, in terms of, and probably also a very important part for the asset management industry here in Ireland, make a few comments on the cooperation agreements between regulators. And so MOUs are very important to prepare for the risks of a no-deal scenario. First of all, they're very important because they are required for this recognition process of CCPs and the CSD, and so that is one of the conditions for the recognition. But in addition to that, we also need these MOUs, as we have with many third country regulators across the country. We have across the world, excuse me. We have these MOUs to support our work to achieve our objectives regarding stability and investor protection, and more specifically, in the case of securities markets, we use these MOUs to conduct our market abuse investigations. And as you probably are aware, we were able very recently to publish the agreement of the various MOUs, and so a number of them relate to the CCPs and the CSD. Some of them also relate to the cooperation, the typical cooperation that we have with third countries between the EU 27 regulators, national regulators, and the UK FCA. But to emphasize, they will only come into force or will only be applicable in the case of a no-deal scenario by the end of March, and also they will in that way contribute to the avoidance of significant cliff edge effects. Let me then look beyond, and having discussed these preparations for Brexit, let me then discuss a bit further the future rules and regulations and how they may need to be adjusted in the context of a very large and liquid market moving out of the EU. First of all, the EU 27 should very much continue their work on the Capital Markets Union. Whatever the future final arrangements will be, we can expect that there will be more barriers between the EU 27 capital markets and the UK capital market, and so further progress with the Capital Markets Union is essential. Part of a successful capital market is also effective regulation, and therefore, as you will understand as a regulator, I will focus on those elements. First of all, what is a very important point is that we have the tools and make sure that there is no regulatory arbitrage across the EU 27. And as has been discussed and reflected already this morning in response to Brexit, there has been relocations of activity from the UK to the EU 27, including here in Ireland. But we need to make sure that this business is received against the same regulatory and supervisory conditions across the EU 27. And so it's fine for financial centers in the EU 27 is when they compete on things like speed and efficiency, but in all cases the EU rulebook should be consistently applied and supervised. And so ESMA, together with the national regulators, is working very hard on that. We have established a specific forum where we meet with the national regulators to discuss relocation cases. We do it on an anonymous basis, and we also conduct there further convergence works. Two that I would like to mention is that we just published a supervisory briefing on so-called backbranching. Backbranching can be a situation where you need to be carefully analyzed that the center of the group is sufficiently substantive and that there is unwarranted movement of, let's say, central functions to the branch in the UK. Also, we have announced that we will conduct and undertake a peer review of national supervisory practices by the end of this year regarding the relocation activities conducted and the supervisory activities conducted by the national regulators. What I would like to stress here in terms of the convergence, and to some extent it's already implicit in what I've said, but we should realize is that the European capital market is changing because of Brexit. It is moving some financial activity that is concentrated in London is moving to different financial centers across the EU. And as a result, that raises the challenges of supervisory consistency and of regulatory consistency, because financial activity that is first concentrated in one financial center is going to multiple financial centers across the EU. In that perspective, I would like to reiterate very much the importance of the Commission proposal for the ESA review. I know it is a very difficult file, but again, the proposals for strengthening convergence that are in there are very needed considering these challenges to supervisory convergence because of this relocation of financial activity. While being on the ESA review, I would like to raise one more point, and that is a proposal by the European Parliament to give us so-called no-action powers. One of the concerns from a regulatory perspective that we have is that our current toolbox is not sufficiently flexible to react to developments in the financial markets. We have those powers not at this stage. We cannot disapply certain rules and regulations at this stage. But my expectation is that in the new EU 27 environment, well, there will be this very large and liquid market next door, but still very important and interconnected with the EU 27 capital markets, is that we need to have the power and the tools to react more rapidly to changing developments in the financial markets. Finally, where I would like to reflect very briefly is on the third country regimes more broadly. The Brexit has initiated a reconsideration of the third country regimes. As you probably are aware, in the typical equivalence regime that we have in the EU, once a country is declared equivalent, the implication is that you fully rely on that third country regulator and supervisory system. And in my view, and also as reflected in some changes, that is not appropriate in some cases where indeed you need to have the powers as a European regulator to intervene when there are certain risks coming from third country entities that are specific for the EU, and you should be able to address those risks. That is already reflected in the EMIR 2.2 proposal, which is the proposal for changing the regulation and supervision of CCPs outside of the EU, and indeed in some cases you would have the powers, the typical supervisory tools when there are risks that are relevant for the EU, that you're able to address that. There's also been in the ESA review proposal the suggestion and the proposal to give the authorities, the European supervisory authorities, the mandate to more frequently assess equivalence outside of the EU. Let me finally then make a remark on the investment firm review. The investment firms are obviously very important for the EU 27 market. We know that there are many UK investment firms that are active in the EU 27. I'm very happy with the progress in the investment firm review in the current discussions in Brussels. There is a suggestion indeed is that the passporting regime would be coupled with some supervisory tools for ESMA, and as I just said, I think that is the right approach, considering the fact that there will be this very large market that will be still very important for the EU 27. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. I have emphasized the importance of preparing for no-deal Brexit. I think Patrick asked me in the break what my chance of what my assessment would be of that risk. I think he would be more qualified to answer that question than I am. And in addition to that, we need to think about the new world after Brexit and how it should change our regulatory system. Thank you very, very much for your attention.